Hello, this is Let's Talk About Myths, baby, and I am your host, Liv, here with the conversation episode, the last conversation episode in the Euripides series, and we're going out with a bang. So the story behind this conversation is that it wasn't originally planned to be part of the series. Michaela and I had been planning the Euripides series for a while, and we had all these guests worked out, and then when I was in Greece, I hung out for not even 48 hours with Cosi of Cosi's Odyssey over on Instagram and Substack and a ton of other places. And Cosi and I mean, among other unhinged rants, we talked about her master's thesis, which aligned very perfectly to what I was writing at the time, the story to come, but also was aligned very well with Euripides. I am talking this in circles. We, today, are talking about the concept of Sparagmos, but Sparagmos and I will explain, Sparagmos very specifically in Euripides' Bacchae, but as depicted visually. Master's theses are always very specific like that, but what it ends up turning into is a conversation about, Euripides, but specifically Pentheus and his Sparagmos, which is the word for a kind of ritual tearing apart that happens to Pentheus at the end of Bacchae. And it was depicted in art of the ancient world, and Cosi studied it, and we had so much fun. This is also very much a conversation between friends in the greatest possible way. I might go too hard in my support for Euripides and have to rein myself back in, because sometimes I need to remember that Aeschylus and Sophocles are good too. With that out of the way, oh my god, please join me for this spectacularly gory. Oh, and that reminds me, this spectacularly gory, and you are all seeing now for the first time, the spooky season artwork. Obviously, we're working with the original art by the Angel Incarnate, which I am so obsessed with, but I also maybe took that art and made it really bloody for these specific episodes. I'm very proud of it. It's very Sparagmos. This is the part of me that's been watching Love Island way too much. It's giving Sparagmos. Conversations. Nothing like a little ritual tearing apart. Sparagmos with Cosi Carnegie. I just pulled out this copy of Bacchae, to match you. I'm trying to explain to the listeners, because I love Anne Carson, everything she does with the ancient world. But I just opened it up to the translator's note, except it's in Carson, so the translator's note is in verse, and it is titled, "I wish I were two dogs, then I could play with me." And it begins, God. Dionysus is a god of the beginning before the beginning. What makes beginning special? Think of your first sip of wine from a really good bottle. Opening page of a crime novel. Start of an idea. And it just keeps going. It's quite fun. What a fun way of doing a translator's note.
That's so, fruity.
It's so Anne Carson. It's and it goes on and on. This is pages of verse as the translator note. I love her.
That's fruity and needlessly erotic. I really
truly
like that.
There's a verse that is, despite all those legends of him as a new god imported to Greece from the East, his name is already on Linear B tablets that date to 12th century BC. But it's still in verse. I'm just I love it. Okay, now I'm not just going to read this translator's note to you.
No, but now you are. I know you are. I see you.
I want to. I'm oh my god, I've never read that before.
I feel like this episode is going to turn into you just reading to me as I just rest my head gently against the wall and you sing me to sleep.
I mean, what the listeners probably won't know about this for a while, but I'll hint, is that the reason that, there's multiple reasons why we're talking about this topic today, but the and I apologize in advance, the boring reason is that Cosi did her dissertation on Sparagmos.
Oh, the boring reason.
I know. But that's because the alternative is that what would I have asked you for? Like, I don't even know. This is basically this word is going to be used in my novel for like really specific reasons that I'm not up for explaining into a microphone just yet. One day you'll all understand.
All will be revealed. I think
then it led...
also just hold on. Just for Liv's listeners, may I just say, smutty is a gross understatement, if I may be so bold. Not gross as in gross, gross as in large. It is a gigantic understatement to say that this is raunchy or smutty. Yeah, I'm gonna read you to filth.
Laughter.
I'm gonna read you to filth on your own podcast.
Yeah, well, I mean, valid. But truly, like, in reference to the actual texts, Sparagmos is not smutty.
No. Well, no. But, we can read into it. It's classical reception, babe. That's what we're doing. To establish for your listeners, I did my master's diss on the Sparagmos of Pentheus, and that technically is the moment in Euripides' Bacchae where Pentheus gets ripped apart by the Maenads, the female followers of Dionysus. And then you have taken the idea of getting torn apart or
ritually torn apart
for religious and divine and orgiastic purposes, and you have used that word. I think I said this 2 months ago when we first spoke about this, which was that the French use the little death, the petit mort. Like, it's, it completely holds up.
It really does. And I'm not ready yet to talk too much about
Liv is shy. She's
the novel. Well, yes, I am, despite what I've written. But I found a way to make it truly the perfect word. And I just enjoy it because the fact that it's also, or like more appropriately used in this context of Pentheus, it just fills me with even more joy. Oh. So, like, okay, can you talk a little bit more about like the word itself? Like, does it appear elsewhere? Is it really specific to Pentheus? Like, what were you looking at?
Well, what I was looking at in my thesis was the visual depiction of Sparagmos on vases. So that's kind of a very, very specific subsection of something which is already wildly specific, which is this one moment where this dude gets ripped apart. And what I did look at as well is that there's this other myth to do with Orpheus, where there's a version where he...
Thank you. I was going to ask about...
Did I beat you?
That was my thought, is like that's the only other instance I can think of where it might appear. So I was curious. Yeah.
No, exactly. And that's exactly what I was curious about. And the visual art that depicts both of the deaths of these men, they represent it really differently. And so that's what I was really taken with, is like, okay, in the mythology and in the literature, we have they die in the same way, apparently, right? So then why on the art is there this huge emphasis on Pentheus getting ripped apart, whereas Orpheus is there kind of naked and afraid and possibly getting stabbed? But, there's not a chick holding up his leg. Whereas, I mean, Liv, I'm sure we'll fling up some images so people can see.
This is not a visual medium.
No, I know. And every time I'm like, oh, I just wish
Cosi
I could
is young and she works in video. I don't like video. So no, but the difference between Pentheus and Orpheus, I'm really interested in that. And maybe you were going to get there and maybe I'm jumping the gun. But I'm trying to think of the mythological sourcing on Orpheus in terms of text. And like, I can only think of Ovid as a surviving source. Do we know much about, like, because I'm just wondering if the ritual tearing apart was as specific in the earlier Greek than, and so maybe that's why the visual stuff is looking so different.
So, short answer, you're bang on the money. you're bang on the money. It is different.
I
and
tend
it comes
to be.
You're like, I love that for me, and I'm not surprised. So you are exactly correct. And also something that I didn't realize until I started working on this topic is that Pentheus, that's a super specific dude and a super specific myth. And rightly or wrongly, Euripides' Bacchae is broadly taken as canon. That's what we have. That's the account. That's what we think of as...
It's like Oedipus of Sophocles. Like, there isn't really an alternative for
Exactly.
us to look at.
Exactly. That's the one. But then, I didn't know this before I started. I feel like I should have, but oh my days. The mythology around Orpheus is this fucking ever-spanning hydra of like poetry, cult, all of these different stories. And honestly, it was like, I was reading books from like 1810 in German. I don't read German. Google Translate on my phone. It was a process trying to chase who said what about Orpheus at any particular time. So the play...
I'm just laughing in my past with the Orphic tradition. It's like a long-running joke on my show.
For Liv's listeners,
I don't like it.
I literally texted Liv and she took pity. She took pity on me because I was like, Liv. And you were like, it's so bad. Here are some things to read. And I was like, thank you. But also, why? It was so horrific. So Orpheus is much more complicated mythologically. And the text that we have that talks about the moment where he is ripped apart by the female followers of Dionysus, it's lost. So it's Aeschylus's play, The Bassarids, which we don't have, but someone else refers to it. So it's tricky. And then what's difficult is that the performance of the Bassarids predates the performance of the Bacchae in the same way that Orpheus comes earlier than Pentheus, generationally speaking,
right,
in the mythology. So it's lesser known and we just don't have access to it. And yet it's predating the Sparagmos of Pentheus. So it's really difficult.
I don't want to turn this into a conversation on Orpheus, and we won't, but also we have to talk about it a little bit. Like, I mean,
I hated him by the end of it.
That's the thing. So to begin this, I'm going to just read our texts when this happened. This was back in April. I'd forgotten about it completely. And I got this text. I don't know the last time we'd spoken. It had probably been a couple weeks because I prefer that it was really out of the blue. And it just said, "Hello, dear one. I am simply begging for some Orpheus/Orphic related help." To melty smiley faces. And I replied just, "Yeah, have fun with that." And then I said I was looking for my sources, and I did end up emailing. I emailed my sources over, and then I just added, "Truly it is the most baffling tradition, so fragmentary and confusing and disparate from the usual mythos. It's wild." So basically I was saying, well, I did say, good luck with that. Because,
honestly.
Well, and the thing that is so unique to what you were dealing with this Orpheus specific question is that, like, it's not just confusing, it's not just fragmentary and lost, like everything is. It's also like was not part of the broader tradition of Greek mythology. Like, it was a subset sect kind of,
well, also,
if mythology is the main religion, this is like a sect. Yeah,
but this is the problem with a mystery cult. Like, it's in
exactly.
very name. Like, that's the nature of it.
But
it's
I don't think it was technically.
We don't have access.
But it was not like a technical.
But, I mean, technically,
but
then there are still Orphic mysteries.
Oh, absolutely.
So
but
so
that's why it's
weird.
so much more baffling. Because the word mystery is. I say that because for the listeners, like, the word mystery in English comes from mystery, like the Eleusinian mysteries. Like, they are explicitly connected, and the Orphic tradition like wasn't that. And it also just like doesn't make any sense. Like, there's like 4 different like theogonies of the Orphic tradition. Like, there was it wasn't even as, even as much as all of the Greek myth tradition is kind of like different across the regions. Like, the Orphic was even worse. So anyway, yes, sorry.
No. Trust me, I really don't want to talk about Orphic religion, but I take your point that we have to. And then, unfortunately, let me raise another equally frustrating point when it comes to Orpheus, which is that we have a lot of later sources which cloud what we are trying to understand about what the Greeks say about him, because we have wave after wave of lovely Romans getting like very obsessed with Orpheus. So when it comes to the myth of his death and why he dies and how he dies, you have Ovid, you have Philocles, you have Virgil, you have Isocrates, like all of these dudes offer different versions of why exactly he died. For some of them, it's all about Eurydice. For others, it's like, no, he like invented homosexuality, and so then that's why he got in trouble. Like the range, oh my word.
And add to that Orpheus exists in the quote-unquote canon, in whatever way that is, like of Greek myth, but also in the Orphic tradition. Like it's not like he was like Zagreus of the Orphic tradition, which Zagreus only exists in the Orphic tradition. But Orpheus also spans the two traditions. And it's just utterly baffling.
I don't know how much of a rabbit hole you want to go down, but I dedicated an entire paragraph to Zagreus because your earlier question
I dedicated 3 episodes to Orphic tradition. I've lost it all in my brain, but
But other instances of Sparagmos, that was a connection I drew, which is like there is this sort of mythological echo somewhere.
I was going to ask, because
foundation of it all is Dionysus,
but also
like
but he's ritually torn apart, and he is reborn and all this weird stuff.
Exactly.
Oh, and then people love to connect it to Christ, even though there is no ancient connection.
Interest.
No,
same. Zero interest, but
same.
Cool.
And I have an interest in saying it's not a thing.
I honestly no. I feel like there are a lot of things that we can connect to the mythology of Christianity, but Dionysus is ours.
Yeah. Absolutely. Well, and also Zagreus. I don't even like connecting Zagreus with Dionysus that much, but that's out of my frustration and distrust of the Orphic tradition.
Yeah, I mean, fair play on that. But to summarize, we have Sparagmos, which is the sort of visceral, physical dismemberment, and not dismemberment with weapons. It is by hand getting ripped apart, and so that happens to Pentheus in Euripides' Bacchae. That happens, I promise, it happens to Orpheus in Aeschylus' Bassarids. And in some later, weirder texts, it happens to Zagreus, whoever the hell that is. And then also, bring it back to the Greeks, it happened within Maenadic cult. So they would rip apart animals as part of their worship of Dionysus. And we have that represented in some of the art, whether or not that's entirely mythological or whether or not that actually was a part of practice. Of course, it's very difficult for any kind of archaeology to prove or disprove that. And of course, all of the writing about Maenadic ritual is, you can imagine, colored by the people that were writing about it.
Do you mean it's been affected by the patriarchy?
What? What?
I have never heard of that before.
That's not a thing. That's not a thing. No. When history is written by men, I don't think that has any impact on.
No, history is
our conception
unbiased.
Of history.
History is history, or herstory, as some like to say.
I knew you were gonna say.
I also hate that. The words are not connected etymologically.
Dude.
It's not empowering women. It's just nonsense.
Pentheus.
I'm
just gonna keep saying his name to you. Pentheus.
So is this something that is depicted like very often? Did they love a good Sparagmos painting?
So, great question.
Thank you.
You're so welcome. That's a great question. And it's quite a specific thing. And again, what I noticed when I was comparing death scenes of Orpheus and Pentheus, there's a lot more of a focus on the Sparagmos of Pentheus. And really clearly showing his dismemberment. But from what we have and with what has been clearly identified as the Sparagmos of Pentheus, we have a dozen.
Okay.
A dozen. So it's not a gigantic amount, but I would very, very strongly argue that it's enough that shows that this was a thing, and this was a thing that people were really quite interested in. And again, we have the image of his Sparagmos spanning a time period. Like, if you look at the different visuals,
That was going to be my question.
You have it back in the day, and then you have it when it gets all pretty.
Okay. So then we definitely know that this, as like something they wanted to depict, is predating Euripides then.
Which gets really fucky. Really fucky when you're trying to figure out what was going on and in what form was the mythology existing before Euripides, and what did Euripides do. There's this great article that I can send to you which goes into such detail about each of the visual depictions of the Sparagmos of Pentheus and tracks them exactly with Euripides and how he describes it, and is it 3 women or is it more women, or in what order did they do the tearing, like, and is really trying to track how it was all evolving and what were the innovations of Euripides, which is just absolutely fascinating.
Yeah. So
really, really cool.
Yeah. So okay. I'm trying to, I mean, how
do you mean jumbly, baby? You're editing this.
I know. Well, that's why I'm trying to form a real thought. How viscerally, like, violent do the depictions get? Like, it's such a violent scene. And so I'm just like, I mean, obviously the Greeks weren't, ones to like keep away from violence. I love it.
So,
but
I mean, this is, I'm sorry to jump in, but this is exactly the thing that pulled me in and was so fascinating, because we have this tension with the Greeks and the way that, they use their art to deal with death and violence and war. And so you have a lot of death scenes and people getting stabbed and, all of this stuff happening. But the idea that a man could be ripped apart by a group of women is, I mean, my gorgeous supervisor like chuckled at me one time and suggested, like, would it even be physically possible, and kind of shot me a look. I'm like, no, we are not going and finding a corpse and seeing what force it would require to actually, like, physically dismember someone just from, like,
it would
pulling
be possible.
Them. Okay, but, like, you would have to have the divine force of Dionysus, like, flowing
through.
Yeah.
Or wine.
Like, or like one and the same, right?
Yeah.
So it's this incredibly gruesome thing. And again, what I became so intrigued by was, yes, you have Orpheus suffering a supposedly similar fate, and yet his body is intact and he's maybe getting stabbed and there's like a bit of blood. And then you have Pentheus and one chick is holding his head. And in the example that you're talking about, his torso has been severed and he's getting pulled apart. And in one of the journal articles that I read, they were talking about his intestines and they described them as spaghetti. Like, it is so graphic, and there are just like little bones sticking out. And there's one, there's just blood everywhere, and there's just red paint, and it's so gory. And there's this incredible one in the Louvre where he's still physically intact. He hasn't been ripped apart yet.
Is this pottery? Sorry.
Yes, it's pottery, and it's stunning. I will send it to you. And he's in the Louvre, you know what I mean? But he's kneeling down and one of his legs is stretched out. And I remember writing about it, and it's just the thing that what initially appears to be an almost balletic pose, like he's semi-pirouetting. And then when you look closer, the angle of the women's faces have their eyebrows like angled down. So they're frowning down at him and they are stretching him to the very limits of his physical body. And so even in the depictions where he's still physically whole, it is so unsettling what these women are doing to him. And the goriness of his death is unique within the visual, like ancient Greek visual culture.
Yeah.
And then you look to Euripides and God, he doesn't mince words. No. He does not mince words as far as what is happening to this poor dude. I mean, the bit that I feel people forget, Pentheus is there. He's dressed up as a Maenad. He's hiding in a tree. They hear him. They are made aware of him. And then, he falls out or they drag him down. And then they rip him apart. And he's getting dismembered by his mum and his auntie and like a family friend. They are ripping him apart. And there is a scene where it's like, yes, he'd been ripped apart, but he was still like moaning because he was still kind of half alive. And it's just, what?
I'm sorry.
What do you mean? What do you mean? Like, your mum's running off with your leg and he's like, ugh. Like, it's just so, spooky season. I am spooked. I am spooked and perturbed and unsettled.
And the Dionysus of it all too, like the
Dionysus of it all.
Because he does this so intentionally. Like, this is Pentheus's punishment, and it's been a while since I read the Bacchae at the time of this recording, but I'm going to be doing a bit of a live reading on Saturday at the time of also this recording, so it'll be in the past by the time this one comes out. For International Podcast Day, I'm sure we'll have posted it somewhere.
Fabulous.
Right? We're doing Emma Pauly's translation because they gave us permission, so we're just going to like read a ton of it in their translation. I'm ready.
That's exciting.
In any case. So yeah, Dionysus is doing this so on purpose. Like, he gives this guy a lot of chances to turn around, and then he's like, well, this is just kind of what you've gotten yourself into. And then it's like the most horrific thing ever. Like, it's funny to me that I guess Medea got a lot more famous, and it's because it's, a mother and her children. But like, the Bacchae is way more violent. Like, it's way more fucked up than Medea in lots of ways. And it's just interesting to me that it hasn't really like become that in the same way. I don't know, but
I think you've touched on a really interesting comparison there, which is again something that came up in my research. But in all seriousness, which is the difference when so the idea that a mother can murder her child is horrible, horrifying, abhorrent, etc. Right, but if you're thinking about the gaze of the ancient male viewer who was looking at these pots or sitting there in the theater, what is freaking you out more personally? The idea that an 8-year-old is going to get stabbed, or the idea that a fully grown man is going to get physically overpowered by a bunch of older women? That was what, again, so fascinating, because you have these kind of babies getting flung about, and what happens to male children? Horrible, sure. But this is, instead of being like, oh, look what could happen to your kids, it's like, no, dude, look what could happen to you. Be nice to your mom. It's just wild.
Okay, that's a really interesting way of seeing it, because as you were talking, I was realizing that like it is still a woman killing her child, even though it's not, it's not framed in the same way, and the difference is that Pentheus is a grown adult. But it's interesting to me that you went that way, because now I'm thinking about it as like, well, I guess it's like a really different type of disturbing, right? Like in terms of Pentheus being ripped apart, the audience is looking at it and what you're saying, they're imagining like, oh my God, could a handful of angry women really do that to me? And like, yeah, they could, man. Fucking watch it. But then, so they're getting that fear for themselves. But then I'm thinking about Medea, and like Medea, I guess would have elicited more of like a disturbance. They would be disturbed more than necessarily like fearful. But I'm just thinking of
also
how
Medea's not made crazy. You can't blame it on a god. That's just Medea.
But exactly. And so now I'm thinking of all the ways where I think Medea's probably would have been more affecting for the male audience for a number of reasons. Like, one, like you said, she's not being affected by a god. But two, she's a wife. She's a spurned wife. Like, these men in the audience are being forced to face the idea that if they, do something horrible to their wives, like, they could, like get this kind of revenge on them. But on top of that, and of course, like, this is lessened by the whole barbarian nature of Medea and everything, but she is still killing Jason's heirs. And I know that like it's not the same, because the whole point is that he wants better heirs because he's a piece of shit. But like it is still eliciting this fear that like you wrong your wife and she could take your heirs. And that's the fear for the men, right? It's like it's why there is so much mythology about like the fear of paternity or you know, a god impregnating your wife out of nowhere and all that, right? Like it's just making me think of all that stuff where it's that fear of your heir, like the males in your line.
Well, I think you're touching on a very, very big theme that we see in the mythology and the drama. But I'd also like to bring up another gigantic theme, which I think is really interesting to talk about when we're comparing Pentheus and Agave and Medea and her sons, which is the idea of your body and your body in death and the violation of your body in death.
Oh, yeah.
And so when you were talking about Medea, it's like horrible, yes, she stabs her sons, but she takes them with her. There is such an importance in how they are going to be buried, you know, the sanctity of their bodies, even in death. And then, you know, we can go back to Homer and Hector and all of the mythos around the treatment of the body in death. And so then moving back to the Sparagmos of Pentheus, you have this ultimate physical violation, and you have your actual physical disintegration. You have loss of identity, and there are horrible scenes where they're gathering up the pieces of his body. And actually, this was such a nerdy rabbit hole that I went down that I was desperate to keep in, but I just didn't have the words. And also it was quite batshit, even by my standards. So I was like, no, we just can't do it. But there's this later Christian text from like 700 AD that uses a whole bunch of lines from Euripides that scholars have looked at, and they've reconstructed some lost passages from Euripides' Bacchae. And one of the passages is the moment where Agave comes to and realizes that she's ripped apart the body of her son. And she is walking around gathering up the pieces of his body and trying, like, putting them back together again. And it's just such a powerful idea. And again, if we're looking at these two examples, and particularly Pentheus, and we're broadening it out to the gigantic context of Greek mythology, and particularly their cult and their rituals around death and the body in death and burial, I think it's a really, really fascinating example of what they were afraid of and, you know, what they were so concerned with. And then again, you know, it doesn't take much for me to bring it back to like batshit psychoanalytic stuff to do with the maternal, but I do feel like it holds up here, where we have a mother violating the body of her son in such a profound, irreversible, dramatic way. So the woman that grew you and fed you and looked after you, she is the one that has destroyed you. Completely and utterly destroyed you. And then again, another thing that I think is fascinating, which a few scholars have written on, is that there's this idea that Pentheus is this like grumpy old man, but in Euripides he's like 18.
Yeah, they're like the same age.
He's like a kid, and he's like just kind of been put in the position of being like, oh, I have to be like a big grown up and da da da. And so I don't know if that makes it better or worse. And again, with some of the vases, some of the earlier ones in particular, he's shown as a bearded man. So then that's going back to our conversation of the different versions. But at least in Euripides, that is a man who is just leaving his maternal household. He's like on the cusp of leaving his family home with his mum. And then she does that. Like, there's so much emotion in this.
There's no mention of his father, though, is there? Like, his grandfather's there. Cadmus is there, which is
Cadmus
also
is around.
Unique that Cadmus is around, even though Pentheus is king. Like,
Cadmus is like gathering up the body parts.
I know. Oh. Yeah, Cadmus is. I mean, he's like part of it, and he really like evokes a lot of emotion in that scene. So, like, you know, having the grandfather there is important, but it's also,
and you know, people suggest that he plays the role of psychoanalyst to Agave.
Oh,
like trying to, because obviously lots of psychoanalytical crazy people like myself look at Euripides a whole lot, and people have literally done like the one-to-one comparison of it's like a psychoanalyst, what he is doing to his daughter to try to get her to come out of her kind of Dionysiac trance. Yeah, it's wild.
Okay, well that leads well into what I wanted to talk about anyway, which is that, like, what are your thoughts on this being done by women? Like, I mean, I've been focusing a lot on the Euripides series about how he portrays women, and, you know, I very much fall on the line of, like, I think he didn't love or hate women. I think he just thought women were people in the same way that he was people. And that's kind of what I find to be the most interesting thing is how he depicted women as just like people, whether they're doing horrific fucked up shit or they're like, I was reading some stuff of Hecuba yesterday. So I've been thinking about her, like,
she's a good one, isn't she?
Exactly. And so I think having like a comparison of these two types of mothers in Euripides is really interesting. Like Hecuba is this like incredibly strong and like protective maternal figure. Terrifying, but like, and terrifying when you've wronged her children. And then Agave is there just sort of like, I mean, she just plays this very, very different role. And so, yeah, I mean, that's a poorly phrased question, but like, what do you think about the fact that it is revolving around women in this way?
How much time do you have?
We got the rest of the episode, friend.
Friend, my guy. What do I think about the fact that Sparagmos is enacted by women?
I like talking about Euripides and women, so we can just go on.
Oh, I mean, this is, what's that meme? Oh my God, I love this question. That's me. That's me right now. I think it is fascinating and it is so apt. And I think we can take this to some really interesting places. The thing that I find the most compelling about it is that in the ancient Greek imagination, the female body was constructed in a very particular way, in that it was liminal. So it didn't have firm boundaries in the way that the male body did. So the female body, yes.
I had a conversation recently with Helen King. I don't know if you know her new book. It's got a couple different names, but I think it's Immaculate Forms is always the main title, and it's about the history of the woman's bodies in terms of like ancient medical understanding. Yeah, it's out in the UK. She works at the Open University. We had the most. She's a joy, and you should listen to my episode on it because it's all this. It's wandering womb. It's all of these wild things they imagined going on within women's bodies.
Exactly. So
yeah,
I mean, Helen King would have said it far better than I'm able to, but that is, I think, the main pull for me is that the female body was leaky and porous and didn't have firm boundaries.
Wet and spongy is how she described it. That's my episode title. Women are wet and spongy.
They are, and they're porous, and they can't be trusted because they can't even keep their body in check. And the kind of framing myth that exists in my mind is the Danaids and their perforated punishment, which these were a group of women that were supposed to marry a bunch of dudes. They didn't want to, so then they cut off all of the dudes' heads, except one Danaid did not do that. But 49 out of 50 of them did it, beheaded all the dudes, buried their heads, and then in the underworld, their punishment was to forever be trying to use a bucket with holes. And so it's the idea that kind of the negative side of femininity and the dangerous side of the feminine is all to do with their bodies leaking and not being able to maintain their own bodily boundaries. Because, you know, remembering how little they would have been able to conceptualize, and frankly, how behind medical science still is when it comes to the female body.
Like,
but that's by the by. You know, trying to wrap your head around why a woman is bleeding, how a woman is able to come pregnant and give birth and then feed the baby, and all of these very, I mean, I don't even want to say that they're complicated processes because they're the most natural processes in the world, but you know what I mean. We have all of this mythology emerging around the female body and all of these very complicated associations with the female and the biological capabilities of the female. And so bringing it back to Sparagmos, I think it's this fantastic part of myth where you have the threat of the female and what the female body can do to itself. You have that being done to men. And I just think that is fascinating. It's this sort of channeling of feminine destructive power and then just flinging it towards a man. And another thing particular to Sparagmos is that one woman can't do it on her own. So we have another theme, which is the threat of collectivity, which, you know, you see in Aristophanes. You see it in so many different examples, which is, yes, fear women, but holy shit, fear women when they're together, because that only makes it worse. So you just have all of these really fascinating things going on.
That's basically just Aristophanes in a line. Sorry, you distracted me with that, because it's true. That's like summarizing Aristophanes' work. And then you add like,
pretty much it.
And also just like a touch of shitting on Euripides, but I think that's connected to the whole woman thing. So
just a dash. No, so that to me is so fascinating. And I think with anything, whether it's a horror film, whatever it is, there's something very psychologically compelling and appealing about just doing a flip. And so if you just flip what the expected role of a mother is, the results are pretty tapped. You know, it's uncanny valley shit. Like when you're watching a horror film and it's the doll or it's the kid or it's whatever. When they're scary, it's the scariest thing in the world. So when you have women who are past child-rearing age, who should just be, I don't know, fucking messing around with their loom weights and like chilling, and they're like, no, they're going to murder you. That's really scary in a way that is more psychologically disturbing than like you getting killed on the battlefield. It's like, well, that was supposed to happen. Your aunties are not supposed to come together and like rip your ankle off. It's like way more stressful conceptualized.
Well, okay. And maybe this is, I'll admit that, you know, at this point, I feel like I am just programmed to see the best in Euripides. But with that said, like, I still think, like, hearing the way you phrase it and everything, I'm just getting this sense that, like, if I was to speculate on what Euripides was doing, like, it feels to me like he's having fun with the audience. Like, I think that he is not afraid of women himself in this depiction, but instead he is, because, I mean, again, like, to me, he just considered women equal in terms of just humanity. Like, I don't think he necessarily thought they deserved equal rights. I think he just recognized that, like, they were capable of human emotions in the same way that men were. The bar is in the ground. But, like, to me, that you know, having this kind of contrast is that he's just kind of interested in capabilities. Like, I think he's interested in this, the capability of women, like the bodies, like you're talking about, all of this that you've just been, you know, going over about, because I'm just now also obsessed with like women not being able to control their bodies, like boundaries, or however you phrased it. It was great. But like, to me, it feels like he's interested in that. And again, like, whether, you know, love or hate, but I think he's just interested in exploring that, and also maybe enjoying the fact that it might make people uncomfortable. And maybe I'm projecting everything. Like, do you have any theories on what the intention could have been in him writing it in this way? It just feels like so
this
much.
specific scene, or Euripides in general, in the way.
Well, Bacchae, I would say broadly, but I'm also happy. Any Euripides, please.
What do I think Euripides' intention was? I feel like that'd be like trying to pin the tail on the donkey kind of thing. I think
I just love to speculate.
No, for sure. And I think he does write women sensationally. Like, that is just a fact. And whether that was because he had some latent feminism bubbling away in him, or because he was like, you know, it's really going to freak everyone out. Imagine this. Like, who knows? Maybe it's because what I would speculate, if I were to be so bold, is that he found a nerve. He found a really sore, scary nerve, and he flicked it a little bit, and he was like, oh shit. And then he started pressing it, and then magic. Like, and he's not the only one to focus on gender conflict. They all do all of the playwrights do in various ways.
But he does it in the most interesting ways. I mean, again, I'm
my
biased, but like...
my one counter off the top of my head would be Aeschylus's Clytemnestra, because he does a pretty good job with her, and when she literally just comes out covered in blood, because you don't get any kind of victorious stuff with the women that rip apart Pentheus.
Yeah.
And yes, Medea, yes, stunning, slay, literally. But with Clytemnestra, you get her coming out covered in blood, being like, yeah, and like, I'm sorry that I had to lie, but I'd do it again. Like, she's just her oratory and the way he writes her oratory and the violence, I think, is unbelievable. But yes, I know Euripides is your boy. And he's my favorite. I don't even know why I'm talking about Aeschylus, but
I think it's a good point. And I think that it makes me want to clarify. This came up in a recent conversation too, because like, I don't think that Aeschylus wasn't good at writing women. I don't think that his Clytemnestra is any less than any of Euripides' women. What I think is interesting is that, like, to me, I don't see Aeschylus or Sophocles, and I haven't read everything both of them have written. I won't pretend I have, but I've read a good amount, even if it's been a while. But I don't see them presenting women that are as across the spectrum of like human complexity. That's what I think Euripides excels at comparatively. Like, Aeschylus can write an incredible Clytemnestra, but she is still a Clytemnestra to be feared by men, right? Very explicitly, which is great. I'm down for that Clytemnestra. But I think Euripides was interested in writing women who, and then I think, comparatively, Antigone is a woman to be respected by men. Like, I think they wrote women who were kind of at either end of the spectrum, whereas Euripides wrote them through all the way in between. Like, that's kind of what I see. And maybe it is, like, I'm biased. And also we have double the Euripides poems. Like, there are so many things.
I mean, you don't want to be that dick that's like, what have we lost? But that's always, it's so difficult to come down on these things.
Yeah. I don't want to say any kind of concrete thing, but in terms of the works we have, like, that's what I like about Euripides, that he can write, say, a Helen and an Alcestis and a Medea and a Negawe. Like,
but I mean, how nerdy am I allowed to get right now? I think you're touching on something really fascinating about Euripides, which again, a lot of the psychoanalytic classical scholars, again, hella niche subsection, but they talk about Euripides and the way that he depicts psychological processes in a way that other playwrights don't. And I think, to your point about how he shows a full range of women and very complex characterization, he also goes into so much detail and so evocatively creates the psychological kind of collapse of a character on stage. And you see that with Pentheus. Again, I made the argument, a lot of people have made the argument, which is that his physical Sparagmos is happening in tandem with his psychological Sparagmos that has been happening throughout the play. And if we go back to Euripides' Medea, the way he writes her, and you're in her mind with her, and her indecision and her agony and her pain, you're living it with her. And it's not quite the same for Pentheus, but you're privy to the psychological process and the kind of psychological decay of a character in extreme distress in a way that other playwrights don't go there in the same way that he does.
I'm really interested in and maybe this is or is not something that you actually looked at, but like, so Bacchae was produced posthumously, right? It's one of his last plays. It was not produced until after Euripides had died and it was produced by his son. So I imagine, I haven't done the deep research on this yet, but I imagine that means that, as far as we know, he wrote it at the end of his life, where he was living in Macedon too. So I think that there's like a lot of interesting things that could be happening there. Like, he's living in Macedon, he's nowhere near Athens, and I don't think he wasn't living in exile, no, but he had been like invited by like the king of Macedon to be up there. And he's writing these plays, but specifically a play like this. He's like probably 75 or something. I feel like he died around 75 or 80. And so like I just feel like having this be one of his last plays, where it feels like a big fuck you, and it's this.
In what way?
Well, in the way of, I mean, I guess having women tear apart a king, like, or just having this god come in and fuck things up so royally. I don't know. It would have been intended for an Athenian audience, and it just, maybe it's not a fuck you so much as just like an old man who doesn't give any fucks anymore. I don't know. Like, he was doing a lot with that play in a way that he hadn't really before in terms of overt violence. And so to have it be right at the end of his life when he's that old and he's not living in Athens, I just feel like there could be something there.
I mean, I haven't considered that previously, but I think there might be something interesting going on with the idea of the foreigner. And I think it's Fromer's Island who's written extensively on how Thebes is the other Athens,
Always.
And I think when you were
always.
talking about Medea and the idea of, being a foreigner, we've got Thebes as that flip. And so with Euripides' Bacchae, of course, it's Thebes. And again, you have Dionysus as kind of, quote unquote, the foreign god coming in, and you have these foreigners engaging in this kind of thing. And then the other thing that people sleep on, and by people, I mean me, when it comes to Euripides' Bacchae, is the idea that the women that rip apart Pentheus, like, they're not technically Maenads.
No.
They're the women that are turned crazy by Dionysus. And then you have his actual Maenads coming from somewhere else, like running around on the mountains. So if we're thinking about Euripides writing and he's no longer living in Athens, so then I guess all of these ideas of the foreign and the foreign other and the barbarian are very much at the fore of his mind. And I think he plays with it in a really fabulous way as far as foreign incursions, but then also the idea of the foreign coming from within the townspeople in the place. So I think maybe that's something that's going on.
Absolutely. But I also think, like, to add to that, because the best thing about Dionysus in general, but specifically in Bacchae, is that he is a foreign god, but he's a foreign god going home. Like, he is this contradiction, right?
Oh,
like,
I know. He's melts
a foreign
the brain.
god, but he's returning to his home in Thebes, and
he's really from there, guys. He's literally from there.
I mean, Pentheus is his cousin. Like, but what it's really interesting too that Euripides kept Cadmus alive, because chronologically it doesn't really track, but they've got him alive, and like there are also, there's existing mythos, and I don't know the timeline in terms of surviving sources, but like there's existing mythos that like Cadmus leaves Thebes, and is
he the one that gets transformed into a snake?
He and his wife do, yes.
They do,
live
don't they?
Happily
they live happily
ever
after as snakes.
Yes, they go off to Illyria and they become snakes.
When is it my turn to be happy?
That couple is the reason I like exist within this field at all. I wrote a novel about them when I was like 20 and then went to university for classics because of it. But so it's really interesting that he kept Cadmus alive, because it allows the grandfather of both Pentheus and Dionysus to experience what's happening. Agawe is very explicitly his aunt, or Dionysus's aunt. So it must be Etonoi and Agawe who partake. I think Ino might be already gone, because Ino is the other daughter, and she ended up getting transformed into a sea goddess at some point. Like, that family is so fucked up.
But also, those women open by being like, Semele was a lying dickhead.
Yeah, well, that's the thing too, because there is so much. Because the whole point of Dionysus being both a foreign god and someone going home is that, like, the whole crux of the play, right, and his anger with Pentheus is that like he is not being acknowledged as the child of a god. And so they have to say that Semele is lying, because that is the only way they can maintain this idea that she did not give birth to a god, right? And like on top of all that, you have this, she is like, or Dionysus is the singular Olympian god who is technically half mortal, but at the same time his grandmother is also a goddess, but never referenced as a goddess in terms of any of that kind of backstory. Like that family so specifically, there's just so much happening, but just that so specific bit of him being this explicit foreigner who's also like, nah, I'm also your cousin and I'm half a god. I brought all these women in. Like, there's so much going on. And so, yeah, this idea that he wrote it not in Athens, about Thebes, but about a foreigner who is also not foreign at all. Like, I just feel like there had to be some thing going on in there for that to be what he was working on at that point in his life. And now I wish I'd dug deeper, and probably will after this.
Well, you can. Yeah.
I will.
I think that sounds like a really, really fascinating rabbit hole.
Yeah. Well, and you know, it was also produced alongside Iphigenia et Aulis, which is interesting too. And that,
also,
and I think I don't think we know the third.
Do you want a little head fuck?
Yeah. Always.
Aeschylus wrote an eponymous play called Pentheus that we've also lost. So when I was trying to compare like the death of Orpheus and the death of Pentheus, it's like Aeschylus wrote the Bassarids about the death of Orpheus, and he had a whole play about Pentheus. Imagine.
You know, he had a whole goddamn play about going to find Medusa.
What?
And yeah, it's called The Four Kitties. It's Daughters of Phorcys. I want it so bad. In the piece I wrote on Medusa, I was just looking over it because I'll tease this to the listeners. At the end of October, I'm going to do a big reading from that piece because the book's coming out on the 29th. And so I was like looking through what I wrote. And when there's a moment, I basically went through all of the ancient sources that mention Medusa to like break down what is going on in each of them. And I wrote a heading that is the ancient play that haunts modern dreams. And then it was just about, and then I think I started the paragraph being like, okay, maybe it's just my dreams, but Aeschylus wrote something called The Four Kitties, the Daughters of Phorcys.
But there is this thing, and imagine if we had it.
Also, though, Euripides wrote a Cadmus, so, like, imagine if they went together in terms of timeline, but also knowing Euripides, like, he probably wrote a Cadmus that was, like, so far off and, like, completely redefines the timeline so that like the Bacchae wouldn't make any sense.
Chronology,
like,
who?
Yes, he's like, I like to make weird things happen.
I love that for him, to be fair.
Yes. Well, I mean, speaking of weird, maybe that's a good place to begin wrapping things up. But I would like to know if there's the weirdest thing you learned while researching Sparagmos. Do you have any? I mean, I feel like you probably said it because you would have already, because that's what we talk about. But
the weirdest thing,
because it's a weird thing to begin with.
Oh, I mean, I honestly, that was so as part of it, I had to do a viva for my master's research, which is essentially
it's a very British thing. Oh, thank you.
It's a very British thing, where you have to defend your work to the people that are marking it. And the first question, honestly, both of the professors kind of laughed at me. And they were like, so, a topic like this doesn't really... we don't really see this a lot. So, what? Like, are you good? Like, is this a cry for help? So it's a very odd and violent and graphic and gruesome topic. Again, happy spooky season. I think, the weirdest things... or the most compelling things I think that I found was two things that I've already mentioned, which is the idea that we've lost a part of Euripides' Bacchae, the part where Agave is beside herself and is trying to put Humpty Dumpty back together again. And this again, like, Liv, you know, I'm sure a lot. Don't laugh. This is serious. I know I said Humpty. I know. And I do it again. I do it again. What did you expect? No, it's very serious. So we have. No, I'm giggling. No, it's serious and sad. So we
got torn apart, Liv.
A man died. So we have that moment, and as you know, what happens with violence in a play, it happens off stage, right? And yet this moment, so imagine that on stage, like dismembered limbs being brought
Oh, you think the
back
actual
together.
physical trying to put them back together might have
I
been
mean,
on stage.
but the conversation between Cadmus and Agave when she's coming
Right.
back to herself and realizing, I mean, what is she holding? She's holding his head, right?
Yeah.
Like that's all
Oh
that's not taking place off stage. That's like the
Yeah.
crux of the fucking end of the play. So
Yeah.
extrapolate that. If what they think the lost part, if what they think is right, then imagine that moment on stage. You were sitting there in the audience and you were watching like a weeping mother putting her son back together again. I think that's incredible. And
It changes the ending too. It makes it like 1,000 times more emotional than horrifying. Because what we have now is pretty horrifying.
So tragic.
Yeah.
And, you know, those is all of that very deeply, deeply moving stuff of, you know, those are the same hands that held him as a baby. And yet they are the same hands that ripped him apart. And finally, they will be the same hands that cradle him and cradle his head and cradle his body and try and put him back together again so he can be whole. And I think that is, I mean, I know I'm taking it to such a serious place, but I think that's one of the most moving things I think I've come across in my entire life. I think that is sensational. And then on a more silly note.
And they never were able to put Humpty Dumpty back together again. Agave never would be able to. That's
all
the real
of the
tragedy.
Horses and all of the king's men.
That's right. All of Cadmus's men, or rather Pentheus's men, couldn't put him back together again.
I want to throw something at you, and you're lucky you're in Canada right now, because I would throw my shoe at you.
Started.
A man died. A man died. And the other thing I think is super weird is, would it have been physically possible for 3 women to rip apart a man limb by limb? And that is a question that I will keep asking.
Well, here I think
it's time for some practical classics. I think
I have a anecdotal answer for you.
What?
Do you ever, you remember those
from an SVU episode? How do you have an anecdotal answer?
Remember that they used to say, this might be like a weird 90s reference. I'm realizing I don't know, it's a thing people still say. But you know, that like
what?
The ability that mothers have to summon strength when it comes to their children, you know, like you could lift a car off your child. But like
you think Uno reverse it?
Yeah.
Uno reverse the maternal protective instinct.
Just little swapsies.
Oh my god. Okay.
Happy spooky season.
I mean, anecdotal evidence.
Do you want to tell my listeners about the event you have coming up in London?
I'd love to. On that note, okay. Okay, let me just, a really important disclaimer I feel is needed here. There will be no Sparagmos on the night of animals, inanimate objects, or men.
Now I am less interested, but
I know you are, but I just feel like for some people it might be important to clarify that will not be taking place. But yes, if you follow me or go to my website or whatever, I'm also going to fling the link at Liv so she can share it with you. But tickets will be on sale and it's going to be a really special evening. And then it is also the first of many. There's going to be another summer one down under back in Australia, in Melbourne in December. And then we're already cooking up a sort of Valentine's Day winter one to do like, I want to do like Eros and Psyche with like oil and lamps and something really naughty. Yeah. But yes.
Well, is there anything else you'd like to tell? Great. Do you want to share any handles or I'll link to things too, but
things. I'm at Cosi's Odyssey on Instagram, Substack, TikTok, Twitter, etc., etc., etc. But Substack is my favorite at the moment. So if you like writing, come on down.
Heck yeah.
Heck yeah.
Thank you so much. This was so
Thank
much
you
fun.
for having me. This was too much fun.
Nerds, that episode was so much fun. We had such a joy, and I can tell you I went almost directly from recording that to recording a Halloween episode with my friends in Ancient History Fangirl that we have coming up for you soon. And so it was just like a day of really, really joyously unhinged rambling amongst friends, all of which centers around incredibly specific and insightful ancient topics, because that is the fun of this job. Let's Talk About Myths, Baby is written and produced by me, Liv Albert. Michaela Pangowish is the Hermes to my Olympians, the producer. The podcast is part of the iHeart Podcasts Network. Listen on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Leave a review on Apple Podcasts for the chance to get featured on my new cat reviews segment on Instagram and on the website and on the new newsletter. I'll be including the cat reviews in the newsletter for those of you not on Instagram. So sign up for the new newsletter at mythsbaby.com/newsletter. And if you are on Spotify, keep commenting. I am obsessed. I am trying to find the perfect way of featuring those in a different way than the reviews of the cat with the cats, but something equally fun and silly. I am Liv, and I really love this shit quite a bit. I didn't mean for that to rhyme. I made it weird.